So that a circle that the how much space, that's for a circle, but with a sphere that you can also use pi to work out the volume of a sphere. Except that's in normal space. In a black hole, the circumference doesn't match the volume inside. The volume is much greater because space-time is warped. So a black hole is bigger on the inside. And we know that from Doctor Who that the TARDIS is powered by a black hole. So when you step through the doors of a TARDIS, are you stepping over the event horizon into a realm within the black hole? And that's how it's bigger on the inside.
Hello and welcome to Trolling with Logic, the podcast where we bring the hammer down on ignorance, unreason, and superstition, and sometimes Daleks and Cybermen too, apparently. I'm Nathan Dickey, your host, and with me as usual is Cal.
Hi, it's good to be here.
And Jen.
Good evening or good midday to you.
And today we are joined by Simon Guerrier, a documentary filmmaker, science fiction author, and dramatist who pretty much lives and breathes in the worlds of Doctor Who. He has written many Doctor Who novels, short stories, comics, audio dramas, etc., in addition to being a regular contributor to Horrible Histories magazine and the medical journal The Lancet Psychiatry. Simon is also the author of a recent nonfiction book he authored with Dr. Marek Kukula called The Scientific Secrets of Doctor Who. He joins us on this episode to discuss this book and what the fantastical elements in Doctor Who can teach us about science in the real world. Welcome to the show, Simon Guerrier.
Thank you very much for having me. Hello.
Yeah, so tell us a little about what inspired you and Dr. Kukula to write about real-world science through the medium of reincarnating Time Lord who travels through time and space in a police box battling evil robots and aliens.
Well, Marek, if he was able to join us on this programme, would tell you that Doctor Who was one of the things that inspired him to become an astrophysicist. And he wanted to be a Time Lord, or failing that, the companion Leela, I think. And that wasn't really a career option at school, so he did physics and ended up working at Jodrell Bank, the radio telescope. And then he worked on the space telescopes and has done all sorts of things and is now the public astronomer in Greenwich. So his sort of path to science and things through Doctor Who is quite clear. Mine was a bit more esoteric because I was an art student at school. I was hopeless at science at school and did my best to avoid it and dodge it as best I could. And then writing Doctor Who stories, a little to my horror, my editors would tell me I had to get the science right or that I should put in explanations that sounded more scientifically plausible. So I found myself as a grown-up having to look into real science. And when I met Marek at an event that we were put together to teach kids about sort of Doctor Who and science and putting them together, I realised there was somebody who could do my homework for me. So I started sending him bits of plot going, how does this sound? Or what explanation can we give? And Marek was very patient for about a year in answering my questions and then suggested that I did the GCSE course in astronomy that his observatory ran as a night class. So I did that, asked it, and we looked at working together and pitching a book. So we pitched a book to the BBC about Doctor Who and science.
Yeah, so we're talking about science and Doctor Who and where those two things intersect. And I'm thinking of in the Doctor Who story, for example, Day of the Daleks, the third Doctor states that he's a scientist, not a politician. So in what ways would you say the Doctor in any or all of his various incarnations exemplifies the scientific method in action?
Oh, wow. Well, that's a broad question. But, I mean, Doctor Who's been running since late 1963 and there's 840 odd episodes, so there's an awful lot of ground that we cover. I think it happens very early on. I mean, the Doctor is a scientist. He's a pioneer of his own people. But in I think it's episode 7 of the series, The Escape, which is the third episode of the first Dalek story. So very early on, there's the Doctor and his companions are trapped in a cell in the Dalek city, and they have to escape. And they do this by making a number of deductions that begin with noticing that the Daleks have a distinctive smell. They smell like the Dodgem cars at a fairground. And from this, they go through a sort of process of deductions about what might the Daleks be powered by, and therefore what their weaknesses might be. And as a result of this, they come up working together with a way of escaping the Dalek cell. And that's important not only because it's the first time that Doctor Who escapes from a prison cell, which becomes something he does quite a lot in the series, but Sidney Newman, who was the head of drama at the BBC at the time and the guy who co-created Doctor Who, wrote to Verity Lambert, the producer, after that episode went out, saying that scene was brilliant, that the thing of them using their intelligence, and we can follow, as an audience, we can follow the Doctor and his friends being intelligent to escape, was something that he thought was really good. And what you then see is the production team working in more scenes like that into the series. So this idea of the Doctor as almost like a scientific detective, but when he lands somewhere, there's a puzzle for him to solve. How does this world work? What are the rules? What are the strange things going on here? And actually, he does that even now. At the moment he steps out of the TARDIS, he's asking questions. What's going on? What are the rules of this world? And often that lands him in trouble with whoever's in charge of that world, which, there's as we say in the book, that there's a parallel with the scientific method right away.
Yeah, because, just to come with this one episode, David Tennant episode, and it's when the alleged ghosts are going about. And I do remember that Rose's mother actually kind of turns to him, and it's quite a good parallel. The Doctor's going to look at this scientifically, but she says, oh, you always have to spoil these things with all your science, don't you? Because she's believing that this is her long-lost relative or something, the ghost she's seeing, but he knows, no, there's something else going on. This isn't right.
Yeah, and that kind of idea that what people want to believe is not necessarily true. I think also there's a thing in Doctor Who, when the Doctor arrives in the present day, it's supposedly the world that we know and recognise, but it never quite is. There's always something odder or stranger going on. And actually the Doctor takes great delight in finding the odd in the ordinary and showing that the world is more interesting and strange than we think it is. And actually I think there's a parallel with science there as well.
In regards to science, one of the tools or gadgets that, of course, has shown up in Doctor Who for, decades now is the sonic screwdriver. Is there actually any science behind that? Is that a possible tool? Is that something that's led to other discoveries? Like we have similar, for example, Star Trek and, tricorders and communicators becoming what we have today in various different sort of medical tools and mobile phones. Has the sonic screwdriver been based on anything science fact, or have there been any other things that have been predicted within Doctor Who that you know of?
Well, the sonic screwdriver was introduced in a 1968 story called Fury from the Deep. And the idea of that story was the script editor, Victor Pemberton, wrote the story, and he had to write out the companion Victoria. And Victoria spent most of her time in Doctor Who screaming and being utterly terrified of the monsters and shadows that she encountered in her travels. And Victor's brilliant idea was that they would face a monster in her final story whose weakness is sound. So basically the monster attacks, and when Victoria screams, the monster retreats. And the Doctor realises this, so amplifies Victoria's screams and defeats the monster, which is a great idea. But he needed, at the beginning of the story, to kind of pave the way for that. So he has a scene in the very first episodes where the Doctor uses sound waves to open a bit of pipe so that they can have a look inside. And Patrick Troughton seems to have ad-libbed the name Sonic Screwdriver. And it's basically a way of introducing the idea that sound is something more than just people talking or screaming, that there's a scientific principle there, that it's a useful, practical thing as well. So I don't think he had any particular scientific intentions behind it. It was just a way of grounding the sort of ending of the story at the beginning and kind of giving a clue to where it was going. And then that prop, that idea got used again. It's used in Patrick Troughton's final story, The War Games, to prove that the Doctor and his companions are from outer space. They show some people in the First World War trenches that are not civilians who should be shot as spies because they've got this sci-fi gadget. And then it gets used in John Pertwee's time. And pretty much it's used to kind of affect things from a distance like a screwdriver, like a tool. It's not particularly complicated in its ability to study and assess things. What changes when they brought it back in the new series in 2005, suddenly the sonic screwdriver can do all sorts of things. And, it can open champagne and it can mend barbed wire and it can be a scanner and it can run programs and stuff. And actually, the reason that's changed is our mobile phones have all got apps in them. I am old enough to remember being offered an upgrade on my mobile phone where it had a camera on it. And I said to the guy in the shop, why on earth would I want a camera on my phone? What would that be for? Whereas now we're used to having a phone that has a camera, that has maps on it, that has all of these applications. So the idea that a sonic screwdriver only unscrewed things would be a bit odd. So actually, I think we can see the pace of technology in the real world and how used we've got to very complicated handheld devices in the way that the sonic screwdriver is portrayed now.
Yeah, talking about the sonic screwdriver, I'm thinking back to what you said earlier about finding the odd and the ordinary. And in some ways, I think the sonic screwdriver kind of exemplifies that, where it's just, it looks like an unfamiliar object to the companions and to the people he encounters, but it's, an all-purpose tool that can get them out of a wide variety of problems and dangers. Most Doctor Who stories are all about escaping the humdrum mundaneness of routine day-to-day life and exploring the cosmos, past, future, and sideways. But then there's the third Doctor and Jo Grant. And this is something you brought up in one chapter of the book that I found really interesting. The companion Jo Grant, who isn't really all that interested in exploring the universe. She's more interested in staying on Earth and saving it from environmental disasters. In what ways does this particular series reflect and tap into what was going on in the real world in terms of the growing public awareness of environmental hazards?
There are a number of things going on. First of all, the reason that Jo Grant is not very interested in travelling in space is because the Doctor is stranded on Earth. At the end, in the final second Doctor story, that he's captured by his own people who exile him to Earth in a particular point in time, and he basically spends the next 3 and a bit years fending off invasions and other disasters involving monsters on Earth. And the idea for that was basically to save money on the point of producing Doctor Who. It was much cheaper. And the problem with that is that normally the companions are all very enthusiastic about going into space. But if you have a companion who's enthusiastic about going into space when you can't go into space, you're kind of pointing out to the audience that it's a bit boring now, isn't it? Do you remember how Doctor Who used to be in the old days when we went into space? Well, it's not like that anymore. So having a companion who's not that impressed kind of makes a virtue of what you're doing by setting it all on contemporary Earth. At the same time, there's a bit of a parallel in that this is... so Jo Grant makes her debut in Terror of the Autons in January 1971, by which time we'd landed on the moon, by which time follow-up missions were going to the moon, and people were losing interest. As a general population, you can see that people are not tuning into the later moon missions, that it's failing to grab the headlines. It's NASA cuts the Apollo missions short. I think they were supposed to run to Apollo 24 and they finished on Apollo 17. So that there is that kind of thing about, is it as exciting and stuff? And actually, 1969, 1970, a couple of years before Jo makes her debut, the space travel in Doctor Who is all quite slow and ponderous and matching the way real space travel to the moon was depicted in the news. There are cliffhangers where the Doctor's rocket goes out of control, just like was happening in the news at the time. And what happens in a Jo Grant story when space travel is not real space travel is not so exciting is they go back to the sort of much more Flash Gordon style of hyperdrives, of model spaceships in space moving at high speeds, of space battles and aliens and all of that sort of stuff. which had kind of lost its way, had not been so fashionable at the time of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin being on the moon. So you can see a whole load of those sorts of currents of things going on. But actually, as we argue in the book, as you say, going to the moon did change people's attitudes about life on Earth. You get the moonrise photos, the photos of the whole disk of Earth from space in colour, this blue-green jewel, and the complex weather patterns and stuff. People start thinking about how fragile the Earth is, how dangerous some of our own man-made activities might be. And there's definitely an argument that I've seen made by a number of scientists that it's as a result of going to the moon and those photographs that you start getting the environmental movement thinking about the whole Earth rather than specific acts of pollution, specific bases or incidents of things going wrong. And Jo ties into all of that. So she makes her debut at the same time as you're getting the first Earth Days. It's the same time that the Gaia movement is gaining traction and stuff like that. So, yeah, you can see all of those things in the air.
It's interesting you should say that, because while you were talking about the blue marble type of thing and seeing the Earth as this sort of fragile object, I've been watching the progress of these 2 hurricanes on Google Earth with the weather map overlay, etc. So I was looking at exactly what you were just describing, which was quite interesting. Yeah,
you see, so all of those satellite things. One of the things I looked up, it's actually on the BBC website, is a panorama from the night of the moon landing in July 1969, and it's a whole bunch of, a bit like, Newsnight now, it's a whole bunch of experts discussing what it means, the significance of it. And there's a little report there of somebody saying, what have the benefits been of going to the moon? And they talk about, well, as a result of the satellite technology and the pictures from space, we have a much better sense of life on Earth, or of the ground-based, they talk about prospecting for oil, but also they're talking about the damage that prospecting for oil is doing because we can see it. So, weather data and all that sort of stuff, NASA has, a great role to play in warning people about natural disasters.
There was one, and this is probably the biggest thing in Doctor Who, the bigger on the inside. I've heard some physicists say there might be some credibility to this. What's your take on it?
Oh, interesting. Pocket universes and stuff like that. Cool.
Yeah, well, we have a chapter on pocket universes, but my colleague Marek has a much simpler explanation, which is black holes, which is, as is explained in The Five Doctors, a classic story from 1983, the ratio of a circumference of a circle to its diameter is defined by the Greek letter pi. So that a circle, that how much space, that's for a circle, but with a sphere, that you can also use pi to work out the volume of a sphere, except that's in normal space. In a black hole, the circumference doesn't match the volume inside. The volume is much greater because space-time is warped. So a black hole is bigger on the inside. And we know that from Doctor Who that the TARDIS is powered by a black hole. So when you step through the doors of a TARDIS, are you stepping over the event horizon into a realm within the black hole? And that's how it's bigger on the inside. There's that. The 1981 story, Logopolis, Baker's final story as the Fourth Doctor, posits something completely different, which is that the writer Christopher Bidmead talks about bubble memory and the way that rooms can be deleted and moved around. Because at the time, and still actually, he was very interested in programming computers. So he, as far as I understand it, it's not my area, but as far as I understand it, in that story, the idea he posits is that the TARDIS works like the memory of a BBC Acorn computer and is programmed in BASIC. And you can move rooms and space around in the same way that you can move the memory. You can sort of play with the memory and the space inside a computer. And that's a completely different model. But I think, there are analogies there.
My favourite episode, or rather the one that I remember from when I was a kid, was probably one of the very first films of Doctor Who. And I was brought up on Doctor Who, but unfortunately I lost touch with it when I moved out when I was 15. But I remember, I think it was the film where you first see this giant circular-ish sort of UFO full of Daleks landing, and it's black and white, and it's London, and this kind of resistance movement. And I absolutely love that film. What's your favourite episode or movie of Doctor Who, and why?
Gosh, well, that is Daleks Invasion 2150 AD.
That's the one.
which was adapted from the second Dalek serial on TV. So the film stars, it's got Bernard Cribbins in it.
That's
as
it,
a policeman and stuff. It's great. It's actually in lurid colour.
Is it? I remember it black and white, but then I was a kid, so everything was black and white when I was a kid.
It may have been shown on a black and white TV, but one of the selling points of those two movies is they were in colour, whereas TV Doctor Who at the time was in black and white. But I like all of Doctor Who, and I find it all fascinating, and I find watching even episodes that I don't think are particularly good or well written or well made, I find fascinating because what is it that's not working? What is it that doesn't fit together? So I've just been watching a 1983 story called Arc of Infinity, which I'm not sure is really very exciting and dramatic and is full of rather long speeches that don't seem to mean anything. And the sets are all quite dull. Even the writer admits that it looks like it is all set in a Starbucks. You know, it's got that kind of coffee lounge production design. But it's full of things that I find really fascinating. There's a whole thing about the Doctor being executed by his own people, even though they know it's wrong. And I find that there's something really interesting about that as an idea. They know he's innocent, but they have to kill him anyway. And they go through this whole thing about the judicial process. And you go, but if it's wrong, the judicial process wouldn't do it. I find all of that really interesting.
It's like the Tales of Wang Chiang in terms of science. That's one of the favourite ones that I can remember in terms of science, which sounds weird because the Tales of Wang Chiang is about this sort of mysterious kind of dude who lives in the sewers and has giant rats. But it's the giant rat side of things that I quite enjoyed. This idea that there's, I suppose in modern sense, it would be genetically modified animals as pets who come around and eat people in the sewers.
Yeah. The Magnus Greel, the villain who's pretending to be the old Chinese god Wang Chiang. He's from the future, and by coming back in time to escape World War VI, he's become horribly mutated and is dying. So he's trying to rejuvenate himself, and he's looking for, and basically what he's doing is feeding off the energy of young women in the East End of London. And the idea is that maybe he's the real Jack the Ripper or something, but they never say that explicitly. And so the giant rat seems to be part of his experiment into, I don't know, whatever it is, stem cells or genetics or, in 1977, when it was made, they would have had a different idea about what the sort of scientific grounding was. But that seems to come from a Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes story. There's what's it called? The Retired Colonel or something, which is a story about a guy who injects himself with, I think it's referred to in the story as monkey serum, because he wants to be younger, because he's married this young woman.
Sounds like something from Brain Dead.
Yeah, and because he's injected himself with monkey serum, he behaves like a monkey in a kind of Jekyll and Hyde thing. So she goes to Sherlock Holmes because she lives on in a tower on the 5th floor of her house or whatever, and she sees her husband at the window, and it's because he's climbed up like a monkey. And I'm not sure how scientifically sound that is, but I've always really liked that as an idea.
Yeah, there was quite a few that weren't particularly scientific. When it's like the X-Files, you get some really sort of woo-woo episodes. Like the one where you've got sort of vampire creatures that live in the sea and they infect the girls of the areas, and the girl becomes sort of vampire-ish type things with long claws. I can't remember what that one's called either, but that creeped me out as a kid.
That's the Curse of Fenric.
Yes.
7th Doctor story from 1989. Yeah, and it should be said, different people making Doctor Who have very different ideas about this. So in 1966... the new production team of producer Innes Lloyd and script editor Jerry Davis were very keen to get the science right and to ground the series in reality. So they actively looked for a scientific advisor, and they met with people like Patrick Moore, and they eventually settled on an ophthalmologist called Kit Pedler, who would appear on sort of TV documentaries at the time, explaining cutting-edge science in a fun and engaging way, it's sort of Brian Cox type figure. And they came up with a bunch of ideas with him, including the 1966 story, The War Machines, in which the gripping sci-fi plot is that there's a computer which can talk to other computers down the telephone line. And there's a whole story that is basically that 20, 30 years before, anybody had really heard about the internet. They also invented the Cybermen a couple of stories later. And so you could see that effort to get science right. Terence Dicks in the 1970s was reading New Scientist. The first time the black hole as a word is used in Doctor Who in the Three Doctors in 1972. I spoke to the writer Bob Baker earlier this year, who was saying that, yes, he was reading Scientific American looking for ideas that he could pitch to the Doctor Who production office. Douglas Adams, who was the script editor of Doctor Who in 1979 and 1980. There's lots of very scientifically literate ideas in his stories, though they're very funny stories. The science is very good. You see it at other periods of the show, and other writers and producers don't really see it as an issue. They don't see why they should get the science right. And I should say, actually, what you get is a story. One of the things that I was really pleased at as we were writing the book is there's a John Pertwee story, Planet of the Daleks, which is set on a planet with volcanoes that are full of ice. A Dalek annual that he wrote soon after refers to these as ice-canos. And at the time he wrote that story, it was a big sci-fi idea. It was more Barbarella than sort of grounded in real science. And 16 years after that went out, Voyager 2 discovered what is called cryovolcanism on Triton, the moon of Neptune. And we now think there are ice volcanoes on several moons in the solar system. So Planet of the Daleks, when it was made and first broadcast, was fantasy. And now it's hard science fiction. And that's not because the story has changed. That's because our understanding of science has changed. So, I spoke to Russell T. Davies about this when I was writing the book, because there's a brilliant description of black holes in, it's either The Impossible Planet or The Satan Pit, the two-parter David Tennant story. And I was looking for a pithy, short, kind of engaging description of black holes. And there's one right there. David Tennant rattles it off. And so I asked Russell what research he'd done, and we had a bit of a chat about him sort of saying, well, the trouble is that if you watch Star Trek The Next Generation, which had a scientific advisor and was very wedded to the idea of real science, now that it's 30 years old, a lot of the science in it is all outdated. It all looks a bit parochial. And actually, if they had thought a bit bigger and a bit madder, they might have been more onto something, because actually what we've discovered has tended to be far outside what we imagined. So actually Doctor Who going for wild, mad ideas rather than tempering everything in contemporary science is probably a safer bet for the long term. I mean, that's one view, but I think that's quite a good bit of advice for the writers and production teams today.
Yeah, in any kind of discussion in which we talk about the intersection between popular sci-fi culture and real science, this one idea that always seems to come up is the sort of truism that life imitates art. And I think you've brought up several examples so far of where that crops up in Doctor Who. In the book, you have a chapter dealing with the idea of the multiverse and parallel space-time dimensions, which is probably the most intriguing to think about in terms of, could this be real? Could this be an instance where the art that we're imagining has a counterpart in reality? What does science have to say about this, and how does science get us to the implication that there is some parallel universe out there where everything that happens in Doctor Who, for example, really has happened, and that in some universes out there, each one of us is the Doctor?
Well, the trouble with parallel universes is it all gets very complicated very quickly. And Brian Greene's, what's it called, The Infinite Universe, is a really good introduction to this sort of area, and covers it much more comprehensively than I could in a short podcast like this. The idea seems to be that the physics at the quantum, at the very, very small level, at the quantum level, millions and millions of times smaller than a normal microscope could see, things behave in a very strange way. And studying their behaviour suggests that the world as we understand it in sort of 3 dimensions of height, breadth and length plus time is not the full picture, and that actually the universe acts in a very peculiar and counterintuitive way. The problem with that is, how do you study it? How do you measure it? How do you test it? And you talked about the scientific method earlier. I have spoken to a number of scientists who say, well, if it's theoretical but you can't test it, the idea of parallel universes is not really science, because science depends on testable hypotheses. So it's a really exciting, engaging idea, and you can see why storytellers use it so much. And parallel universes have the great benefit, if you're making television, of they're quite cheap to do because you use the same actors. You dress them up in slightly different costumes and get them to play slightly different characters. And the actors all love doing it because it's a bit broader than what they usually get to do. And you don't have to change things too much, and you can use the same standing sets. So it's from a practical point of view, it's very attractive. But is it hard science? I can see the groundwork in the theory. I can see the sort of mathematical basis for it. But yeah, I don't want to nail my colours to a mast, because far more intelligent, far more scientifically grounded people than me argue about it in greater depth than I am capable of. So one for your listeners to explore themselves, I think.
I did have another question, but Callum, did you want to ask something beforehand?
No, I was all right there. You go ahead, Jen.
I have a question that's not necessarily science related, but more related to the missing episodes, because as we know, there were many routinely deleted episodes as part of sort of BBC culls in the 1970s and 60s. And whilst all of the episodes, as far as I'm aware, are still there in audio form, most of the video footage is missing.
So there are 97 episodes of the 253 episodes of Doctor Who shown in the 1960s. 97 of them are missing, but the soundtracks exist.
Which one of those would you personally like to see restored, and which one of those missing ones do you think has the most scientific basis and would be most enjoyable to see?
If I could have one complete story returned to the archive, I would choose the Dalek Master Plan, because although 3 episodes of it exist, it's a 12-episode story. It ran for 3 months. And so it's the most number of episodes you could get back in one story. And just on that numbers game, I'd like it. Also, it's episode 7, The Feast of Stephen, was shown on Christmas Day, 1965. And it's a bit of an oddball story. It's not really related to the rest of the plot. The Dalek Master Plan, as you'll guess from its title, is a story about the Daleks who don't appear in The Feast of Stephen. And it's a slightly screwball thing. They end up in a silent comedy running around, and the Doctor drinks champagne at the end and toasts the viewer and says a Merry Christmas to all of you at home. And as a result of that, it was not included when the rest of the story, the other 11 episodes, were sold for broadcast abroad. And because a lot of the episodes that are rediscovered come from abroad, it means that The Feast of Stephen is the least likely of all the 97 episodes to be found again. It's the one that would be most miraculous to return. So if you got that back, it would raise the hope that everything else was out there. So because The Feast of Stephen is the one that suggests that more might be out there, more than any other, and because you get the most episodes back, I'm going for the Daleks Master Plan.
That's interesting, but would you not be worried that it'd be a little bit like the Star Wars Wookiee Christmas special, and it would just ruin everything?
I love the Wookiee special. As I said, I like Doctor Who because it's so peculiar and because it's so... I'd love to see it, because the other thing is, because it has this whole silent sequence, we have very few photographs of it. The off-air photographs taken by one of the actors who was in it are all a bit blurry. And because it's a silent comedy, the soundtrack doesn't really give you a sense of what it was like. And even if it was awful, I'd find it fascinating to see. And yeah, I don't mind Doctor Who being terrible. I find it as interesting when it's not very good.
That does sound very interesting, yeah.
As for the scientific, there's loads. I mean, I've written a book about a 1967 story called The Evil of the Daleks, which is a 7-part story of which only episode 2 exists. I'd love to see that. And it has a scientific... It basically has a Victorian scientist who invents time travel, and as a result of it summons the Daleks to his Victorian house, and then has to do a pact with the Daleks who kidnap the Doctor and stuff. And the science in it, I make a valiant effort to defend the science in it in my book. But yeah, I'd like to see that. I'd really like to see that.
I suppose recording equipment in those days was quite sparse, wasn't it? Not everyone had a piece of recording equipment in their house, so not everyone watching would have been able to record it. I suppose that's one of the reasons that these shows are so rare, is because whereas nowadays you can record things on your phone with a screen capture, in those days the technology just wasn't as commonplace.
Yeah, I think the BBC had the ability to record programmes in 58, 57. So when Doctor Who began in 63, it's still a relatively new technology. The tapes were the actual magnetic tapes that they recorded programmes on were very expensive. So all of those got wiped when it was known that Doctor Who was going into colour in 69. They basically wiped all of those. So the only thing that survives are 16mm film recordings of those tapes. So we don't have any of the original programmes. We only have the copies of them, which vary in quality. It's the early to mid-70s that you start getting video recorders in people's homes. A record producer called Ian Levine, who recorded a lot of early Take That stuff, had a video recorder in 1976. And as a result of buying that, he then got in contact with the BBC to ask if he could, because he had a bit of money being a music producer, he asked the BBC if he could buy copies of old episodes. And as a result of him pushing to find out what was going on, discovered that they were wiping a lot of the 16mm copies and stuff. And working with the BBC archives, he was able to get that stopped. And Ian is responsible for an awful lot of the episodes that still survive being available to us now. So yeah, again, the sort of being a Doctor Who fan and studying the history of the programme, you learn all about the science of these things on that basis, on the production side and on the side of how we have it now.
Yeah, because the turning up of some of these stories is it's a kind of weird and fantastical journey, because I heard some tapes have turned up in places like Nigeria and all that. They've been found in like all kinds of far-flung, and no one really knows how they end up there. It's kind of...
Oh, well, they do. Richard Molesworth wrote an amazing book called Wiped, which is an exhaustive history of how these episodes are found out. What would happen is that the BBC would sell programmes, television abroad, as they still do. And in those days, what you'd do is you'd set up there was a system to make 16mm film copies of the original videotapes. So they would send out physical cans of tape to TV stations around the world, usually to former British colonies. So, Australia, New Zealand, places in Africa, Hong Kong, places like that, where you had an English-speaking population, usually of expats. And these episodes would be shown, and what would happen is that you'd maybe send the episodes to Hong Kong and Singapore, who would have instructions to broadcast it and then forward it on to another country. And we have all the paperwork, so we know where these cans went. And some extraordinarily dedicated fans have spent years following the paper trails and getting in contact with the TV companies to find out what happened to these tins. And, and we know when films were destroyed, because the instructions on the film cans were, once they'd been broadcast and finished being used, they were either to be sent back to the BBC or to be destroyed. And we know that some of the cans that were faithfully sent back to the BBC were destroyed. And we know that other cans were put in cupboards and forgotten about and discovered. We know that 12 episodes of late William Hartnell, the first Doctor, that were missing were destroyed in Sierra Leone as late as 1999, which... I feel an icy chill around my heart about. So yeah, and we also have really peculiar things in New Zealand. The New Zealand censor decided that some Doctor Who episodes were too scary for broadcast, so they cut the scary bits, and the bits that they literally physically cut from the film, from the rolls of film, they faithfully filed away in their archive with a justification of why they'd cut them. And those episodes no longer exist, but the cut bits of film do. So, for example, a story called The Macra Terror, we've got about 40 seconds of just the really exciting stuff, which gives you a flavour of what the story must have been like. But that, I think there's about 14 episodes where we have footage from those censor bits, but we don't have the episodes.
The Macra Terror was the one with the crab claw, so lobster people, wasn't it? Is that right?
Yes, the wheeze in the story is that they have these huge monsters, but everybody's been indoctrinated not to believe in them. So Macra don't exist. And then the Macra appeared in a David Tennant episode called Gridlock as well.
It's interesting, this whole search for so-called Doctor Who treasure, isn't it? It's like like there's a treasure map of all these different locations where these could potentially be, and people are following them around. It's
true of the missing episodes. It's also true of finding out about Doctor Who. There's a dedicated bunch of people who track where it's being filmed and recorded and go to the locations and, sort of piece together what's happening in production. I am one of a number of researchers who spend our time looking for new nuggets of information about old Doctor Who. Old photos, any new facts about the series, how it's made, how it relates to stuff. And I think, it's such a rich and interesting series. It's been running for so long. It's so complicated in terms of making it, but there's loads to explore in it. It's a treasure trove.
There is one episode kind of quite famously for being sort of incomprehensible. I just wanted to ask you about this, and that's Ghostlight and the science behind it. So what is the science? I've watched it a few times and I'm still not 100% on what was actually going on there.
Right, well, it's funny you should say that there's a story that's, derided for its science. That's not the one I thought you were going to say.
All right.
There are a number of other candidates which manners and tact prevent me from naming, but I've heard various people criticise the science in various episodes. Ghostlight is amazing, dense script by my friend Mark Platt, and I actually think the problem with Ghostlight, is not that it's a complex story. It's just very densely told. There's a lot going on in it. It's really rich. The dialogue is really beautiful and full of wonderful turns of phrase. And there's lots of very interesting characters and things going on and jokes. And it feels very, very, very clever because it's so densely written. But actually, if it was a 4-part story rather than a 3-part story and there was more room to breathe, I think it would be easier to follow. And part of the issue is that the story overran, so they had to cut it down. So you don't get that room to breathe. But you have this in a lot of films. I mean, the film Dune, the sci-fi film Dune, directed by David Lynch, has the same problem, which is that it's actually quite a straightforward story. But what happened on that film was that you kept having executives going, you've referred to this, can you explain it? You've referred to that, can you explain it? So you have this great big bit of narration, and then you have multiple narrators narrating different bits, explaining to you things that are going on. Whereas if you watch something like Star Wars, the original Star Wars from 1977, there's loads of stuff in that they never explain what it is. You get loads of references to things like the Clone Wars and to the spice mines and to whatever else that you just let wash over you, and you just concentrate on the meat of the plot. And I think that's the issue. The exposition too much. There's a lot of science fiction fans I've discovered who like everything explained and everything spelt out, and think that if things aren't spelt out by the Doctor in a Doctor Who story, the science doesn't make sense. But anyway, that's veering off the point. Ghostlight. There is an alien called Light whose job is to catalogue all of life in the universe, and he comes to Earth in prehistoric times at the time of the Neanderthals, and he sends out his survey sort of system, which seems to be a life form. And the life form, to catalogue Earth, goes out and kind of evolves to meet its surroundings and to blend in and to be able to interact with Earth as it catalogues things. And at the same time, sort of evolving, it kind of counter-evolving is Control, who's a life form that effectively evolves the other way, so that you have this kind of parallel evolution going on. But then Light, who is a bit, anally retentive about these things, discovers that life is evolving, that it's always changing. So therefore, no sooner has he completed his catalogue, then it's out of kilter. It's out of date, and he effectively hides away on Earth for millions of years before he's resurrected in the 1880s. Discovers that his catalogue is completely out of kilter. Oh, actually, he's still asleep. It's the survey creature who wakes up and is now calling himself Josiah and has evolved as a Victorian gentleman and keeps Control locked away in a box. And he basically is evolving to take over the world. That's it, or to take over the British Empire. That's his thing, and he's going to marry Queen Victoria or assassinate her. And the Doctor arrives at this point and wakes up Light, who is supposed to stop Josiah, but actually is so horrified by what's going on with Earth evolving and life evolving on Earth that he basically decides he's going to wipe out the planet to stop it from going any further. So the Doctor, having thought he was stopping one problem, has actually created a much bigger problem.
In a slightly different, in a slight segue from what we've been talking about again, because I just happen to do that all the time. That's mine.
That's fine.
I was wondering if you ever thought that there was ever a companion who was at risk of kind of outshining the Doctor in any way.
Oh yeah, there's some great companions. I would recommend a 1979 story called The Horns of Nimon, Tom Baker story, script edited by Douglas Adams, in which the Doctor's Time Lady companion Romana, she even has her own sonic screwdriver, which he steals because it's better than his. It's a really funny story. The production values are not great. It looks a bit cheap. It has a quite extraordinary performance by Graham Crowden as the villain, which over the top does not begin to describe how brilliant his performance is. It makes Brian Blessed look like a rather subdued character actor.
Oh, Carol, you'll like that one then.
Yeah, I love The Haunts of Nimon. It's very funny. It's also got Blue Peter presenter Janet Ellis in it, which I like Janet Ellis, so that's a particular pleasure of mine. There's a number of characters. Liz Shaw, who is in Doctor Who in the first John Pertwee season, she has degrees in physics and medicine. She's very, very smart, very, very capable. And we learn in Terror of the Autons, Joe Grant's first story, that Liz left to go back to Cambridge because she was bored. There was nothing for her to do. And you kind of go, that's a character who's there. I think Martha Jones leaves the 10th Doctor because, if he's not going to be interested in her, she's got too much self-respect. And, I think that's a remarkable thing for a Doctor Who companion to do. More power to her.
The Horns of Nimon was also the kind of a surprising episode in a lot of ways because it suggests that the Doctor's own species, the Time Lords, don't fully understand how black holes are being harnessed to power the TARDIS. And this is something that I found really fascinating, this kind of in-universe mystery that surrounds the source of the TARDIS's power and how black holes might be conceived of as an engine of sorts. Was this in-universe mystery the result of just a lot of retconning and writers being at odds with each other and not kind of consulting past story arcs? Or was it actually designed to be like a mystery that had to be unraveled?
The former. Yes, it's the use of black holes in Doctor Who since they were first mentioned in The Three Doctors in 1972 is not very consistent. There is clearly an attempt to be consistent, but actually when people try to be consistent, it doesn't work. So yeah, we have an attempt in our book to sort of rationalise what's going on. I think what's going on is that it's not the in-universe stuff that's changing, it's the general public's understanding of black holes that's changing. We have become much more familiar with what they are and what they mean, so that the level of explanation needed if a black hole is mentioned now, the Doctor in Journey to the Centre of the TARDIS in 2013 just casually mentions that there's a black hole at the centre of the TARDIS that runs it, that its engine is a black hole. In the 1977 story, The Deadly Assassin, the Doctor needs a whole speech to explain that the Time Lords get their power from a black hole. It's a great long bit of exposition because people didn't get it. You needed to explain that. So what you can see is, so in the early days, in the 70s, black holes are these impossible, extraordinary events that even the Time Lords don't really get their heads around. Whereas now, the Doctor's got one in his spaceship and runs his systems off it. And that's an indicator of how much more familiar we are. There are lots of scientific ideas like that. The idea of if you see anything even remotely like a mobile telephone in science fiction, like the tricorder, the communicators in Star Trek. In the 60s, they have to explain what they are. Nowadays, you just wouldn't do that, because we're so familiar with what these things are. All the sort of exposition and stuff, the necessary exposition, can be done away with now, because we're much more savvy to these concepts.
Yeah, and like with franchises like Star Wars, we've all seen what happens when we have too much expositions. This is how midi-chlorians happen.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and also what you have to ask with that explanation is what does it add? I don't really mind the idea of midi-chlorians. They just explain it in great depth. You know, we don't need to be told that Yoda has a high midi-chlorian count. That is implicit in midi-chlorians are, yeah, it's the clunkiness of that exposition, rather than them going, you know, I find it a bit odd that the Force is something that's in your blood, because that kind of suggests that there's eugenics, that there are families that are better at the Force. It gets into a sort of ugly area, I think, of hereditability, of, you know, of all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, it gets into an area of science that has been widely discredited in terms of eugenics, and, you know, who's got better blood. So that takes you into a really ugly area.
Plus, it also kind of makes Yoda's line in Empire Strikes Back, "We are not this crude matter," just, it sort of falls flat then.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, getting into this idea of this ugly nature to things. I'm interested in your kind of treatment of what exactly is a time war, and how this central underlying plot element in Doctor Who highlights the tension between peaceful scientific inquiry that's designed for the betterment of humankind on the one hand, and conquest and warmongering that's driven by the same level of scientific technology on the other hand.
Yeah, I think certainly in 70s Doctor Who, I think there is an explicit discussion or exploration of the idea of the good scientist and the bad scientist. Stories like Genesis of the Daleks are a classic that from 1975 that readers of Doctor Who magazine once voted the best Doctor Who story of all. There's an explicit distinction made between the Doctor as a good scientist and Davros and the Daleks as bad scientists. And they are interested in a lot of the same areas. They can have a very sort of engaging discussion on scientific ethics and stuff, but they fundamentally disagree in their approach to science and their responsibilities and stuff. And you can see that in a number of other stories. It comes up time and again. It's in Planet of the Evil, it's in Day of the Daleks, it's in a whole load of stories. I think more recently, the Doctor's been much more wary of describing himself as a scientist, as if that automatically gives him authority. I think times have changed, that we're much more suspicious of people claiming authority, whoever they may be. But the idea of good science and bad science is still there. There are an awful lot of bad scientists in Doctor Who that the Doctor battles. And the Time War is like a number of things. It's full of ultimate weapons. It's full of the victims of these ultimate weapons as well. I mean, the first that we meet are the Elf in The Unquiet Dead in 2005. These people who've lost their physical form and are just sort of gas creatures, almost like ghosts. And there is this idea that there are consequences. And I think Doctor Who is generally very good at consequences, that actions lead to things that you're not necessarily predicting, and that there's always a price to be paid for these things. And I think in that way, that's less science. I think what it's probably doing is following in a tradition of sort of philosophical, kind of British liberalism, and whether it's right to make an intervention. You know, you can talk about sort of Gladstone and whether it was right to go into particular wars or whatever. And I think that's that's a political philosophy thing that Doctor Who is carrying on in a traditions of English drama. And it's a sort of post-colonial idea as well.
Where do you see Doctor Who going in the next few years? I don't know personally anything really about the most recent seasons. I know Leona, my friend, has been watching it and trying to catch up, but I'm not joined in on it, unfortunately. I've been too busy. So I don't really know much about the most recent seasons, and I also don't know where the show is going at the moment. So for people such as myself who have lost touch with it, where's it out right now, and where's it leading to, and where would you like to see it getting to in the next few years?
Well, I would definitely recommend this last series. Start with season 10, the episode The Pilot, which introduces a brilliant new companion in a Bill Potts, played by the amazing Pearl Mackie. I thought that was so good, so engaging, so fun. It's the first series that my young son has watched as it's gone out, and he was utterly hooked by it. It's a really good, strong run of episodes and is a great jumping on place. But as for where it's going, the Christmas special coming this Christmas is the final one featuring Peter Capaldi's 12th Doctor. And I gather that at the end of it, we will see him regenerate into Jodie Whittaker, the first female Doctor. So that is all very exciting. As for what happens next, I don't know. Normally, working in the Doctor Who stuff that I work in, I would at least have heard some rumours. I know a number of people who work on the programme and around it, and I'd have heard something. I know nothing about what's coming, and it's very exciting.
So you've not put any sort of scripts in yourself that you might have written on the sly for a couple of shows?
No, it doesn't work like that. The people who tend to write for Doctor Who, tend to have written a lot of telly, but they also tend to have run their own TV shows in one form or another. So, yeah, you tend to find that they're looking for people who are, because it's such a complicated show to make and produce, and you're really pushing against the limits of what's possible. Yeah, I'd need to be a lot more senior. But I write the books and the comics and stuff, so I may well get briefed in time on what's happening.
I've always been curious, like writing sort of these expanded universe novels. Do you get sort of peer reviewed by the higher ups at the BBC about what you can and can't put in the books? Like, is there certain areas you're just not allowed to touch with the Doctor Who novels?
There's not a Bible, which is what you get on other franchises. I wrote a book for the BBC's Robin Hood. I did an audiobook for the BBC's Robin Hood series. And there was a whole document about what the series was and what it was trying to do and whatever. Doctor Who doesn't have that. But there are general rules that, no swearing, no explicit violence. There are lots of things that are sort of handed down things that they don't like the sonic screwdriver being used as a weapon. And they don't like, I can't think of other things, various bits and things. There's all sorts of certain sensitivities. It's got to be for a family audience. So you need to be wary of how you push through scares and some of the ideas that you put. A good example of this is I wrote a novel 10 years ago, The Pirate Loop, in which David Tennant's Doctor and Martha Jones fight space pirate badgers. And it's quite a silly story. But at one point I killed Martha, I killed the companion. And I had her stabbed by a space pirate badger. And the thing is that Martha's I don't know why you're laughing. It's very serious.
Being stabbed by a badger is just, I can picture it in my mind. You get mugged. You're walking along a country road at night and a badger comes out of the brush and sort of holds you up and steals all your conkers and then stabs you. That's what I'm picturing.
But Martha is a medical doctor and she's trained in London. So as part of her training, she would have done knife wounds. She would have done A&E and dealt with that. So I spoke to a doctor about what you would do if you yourself were stabbed and you were a doctor. And he gave me a whole sort of series of things that you'd try and lower your heart rate and keep calm. You might lie down and lift your legs up because the blood would come down from your legs and so give you, because the big thing is blood loss. So that's the thing, and try and keep calm and try and stop the bleeding and whatever. So I wrote that because I thought that showed Martha in character and it uses who she is, and it's her having an intelligent response to what's happened and stuff. The guy who was looking over it on part of the production team at Cardiff, where Doctor Who's made, was a guy called Gary Russell, who I've worked with for years and years. And Gary just said, it makes it too horrific. So what he did was he just took out the 2 paragraphs of Martha's response. So it's much quicker. She gets stabbed. She realises she's been stabbed. She falls over and she dies. End of chapter. And so what happens is exactly the same, but how I convey it is different. And it's just much more to the point, because getting into Martha's head as she analyses what's happened was just too nasty. So it's that sort of thing. It's much more about tone than it is about what you can and can't do.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we're talking about the new Doctor being a woman, and I, just in my own view, I think this is going to actually be one of the best vehicles for having her meet up with old companions, just for the reaction and all of that, because in a way that could mirror some of the bizarre outrage that there's been over this.
The more I think about it, I actually sat in a panel years ago at a sci-fi convention where the possibility was being discussed, and one of the women on the panel started to suggest ways that you might use it in stories. Would the Daleks notice? Would the Daleks use he and him when referring to the Doctor? Will people talk over her? Will, all of this sort of stuff. What will she wear? How will people relate to her? All of those sorts of things. I find the more I was thinking about it, it's not just that it affects her first story, it affects everything. So I just find that really exciting. I just think it's very engaging. And I just speaking to, kids and stuff, they're all excited. They just think it's a very exciting, different, good thing to do. So yeah. I'm very excited about it.
This isn't the this would be the first time that the Doctor would be regenerated and become a woman, but this isn't actually the first story where a Time Lord in general has been featured who is a woman. Is that correct? Or am I...
Yes, that's right. So we first see a man-to-woman regeneration in Hell-Bent, a story from 2015. But the year before, the Master was introduced as a woman, played by Michelle Gomez, which implies that Time Lords can regenerate into different forms. In fact, the TV movie in 1996, the Paul McGann TV movie, the Master appears to be a sort of jelly snake at one point. So clearly Time Lords can be all sorts of things. And the first female Time Lord is Rodan, seen in Invasion of Time in 1978. So there had been a feeling before that perhaps the Time Lords were all men, but these things change. And actually, given what's said in Hellbent, it seems that the Doctor is the unusual one in having been a man for so long. So yeah,
because I think even the regeneration scene at Christmas, if it's written well, it could actually be fantastic just to see that on its own.
You just want to see the Doctor growing breasts, don't you?
Yeah, I'm remembering the David Tennant regeneration scene where he's disappointed that he's not a ginger and he's always wanted to be a ginger.
Yeah, because I think, and then there's like the Christopher Eccleston one where he says, I might come back with 2 heads or no heads at all. So it's always just, I'm really kind of confused when people are so shocked that it could be a woman when it's been stated many times it could be anything that the Doctor regenerated.
Speaking as a Doctor Who fan, the temptation is always to be a bit conservative and a bit protective about Doctor Who, especially anything that you feel might lend the series towards... That sentence doesn't even make sense. You're particularly wary of anything that you think might encourage ridicule or scepticism and stuff. We're very protective of our programme. But in this case, I don't see why that would be. Also, you base all of your sort of feelings about Doctor Who on what's gone before. So, for a series that's all about change and the wonder of things not being as you think they are, there's an awful lot of Doctor Who fans who only want it to be like it used to be. I certainly get, when people, talking to me about where I get my ideas from, you do see on the internet an awful lot of people going, well, how about this monster from an old episode meets this monster from an old episode in a story that's a bit like this old story? And you kind of go, well, yeah, but you want to add something a bit new, don't you? And come up with something that hasn't been done? Why not just go and watch the DVD of that old story if that's what you want?
Yeah, it's kind of the Star Wars Rogue One effect, which I think that film was just exactly what you were describing. It was like, let's get this back and this back and this back, but package it as being new kind of thing for the fans.
But I thought what Rogue One did brilliantly was to tell a new story that we all thought we knew. The weird thing about Rogue One, I think, is that having watched it in the cinema, my son and I then watched, I hate calling it A New Hope, but, A New Hope. And the title crawl of A New Hope is a massive spoiler for what's just happened in Rogue One. And you go, I've watched that crawl, so God knows how many times since I was a kid. And I watched Rogue One going, I've no idea where this is going to go, because they told it in such a way that I didn't join the dots.
Are you excited for the next film coming out soon?
The next Star Wars film, yes, very excited. Yeah, very excited. My son's been playing with his BB-8 toy all afternoon.
You haven't been tempted to get that new Millennium Falcon, that 650 quid Millennium Falcon, have you? The Lego one?
Well, kind of, I'm never going to get it. Yes, it would be a nice It'll be a nice. My son's in a destroy his Lego sets kind of phase at the moment. So we tend to. We bought him an X-wing for Christmas because it had the little BB-8 toy in it, and his particular thing is BB-8. And we made it. We made the X-wing, and he was very pleased with it for a day, and then it was in a dogfight and it smashed, and we've not quite managed to put it back together again. So yeah, that Millennium Falcon would be utterly wasted on us. So,
well, if you made it, and it is 5,000 pieces, and it's probably as big as your son, so it probably would. You probably wouldn't be able to lift it. You'd be fine.
Yeah. I've got some friends who are much more hardcore Lego aficionados, and I know that there's just no point in me taking my son round to their houses, because the idea of Lego you can't touch is just let alone Lego you can't break just is missing the point as far as he's concerned.
I was going to say just one thing about things coming. What's your feelings on the new Star Trek, which is just I think 2 weeks away now?
Is this a TV series? I've seen the trailer, but apart from that I don't really know anything about it, so I'm a bit behind on following TV shows. I think
it's 24th of September it hits Netflix for us in the UK, the first episode.
It hits CBS's website, which is going to be behind a paywall, is what I heard.
Yeah, I'll get to it in time.
Yeah, but
not when it goes out.
I say for us, for worldwide, it's going to be on Netflix. So
we're about ready to wrap up this particular episode. We want to thank very much Simon Guerrier for taking time out of his day to join us.
Oh, my pleasure. It's been fun.
It's been great.
Yeah, it's been great.
It's been another one of those great geek-heavy discussions that we love so much, that we've had a couple of in the past couple episodes. So thank you, and thank you to my regular panel, and thank you to myself for waking up in time to be here, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Trolling with Logic. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. If you love the show, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Supporting us at $5 or more per episode will get you access to exclusive, patron-only bonus content, early access to shows before everyone else, and other incentives. We are an amateur production, but with your patronage, we can help improve our audio quality and cover the costs for doing the show. We are grateful for anything you can pledge to the show. Go to www.patreon.com/trollingwithlogic to sign up if you are so inclined. We want to thank our 4 patrons who currently have chosen to support us. These patrons are Microbloganism, Josh at the Society for the Advancement of Science, Avinash Kumar, and Brian Curran. Thank you very much for your support, which is helping us out. If you have any suggestions for topics or guests you would like to hear on this show, let us know on Twitter or on our Facebook page. Thanks again for listening.
You know, the doctor's going to look at this scientifically, but she says, oh, you always have to spoil these things with all your science, don't you? You know, because she's believing that this is her long-lost relative or something, the ghost she's seeing, but he knows, no, there's something else going on. This isn't right.
Yeah. And that kind of idea that what people want to believe is not necessarily true. I think also there's a thing in Doctor Who, when the Doctor arrives in the present day, it's supposedly the world that we know and recognise, but it never quite is. There's always something odder or stranger going on. And actually the Doctor takes great delight in finding the odd in the ordinary and showing that the world is more interesting and strange than we think it is. And actually I think there's a parallel with science there as well.
In regards to science, one of the tools or gadgets that, of course, has shown up in Doctor Who for, decades now is the sonic screwdriver. Is there actually any science behind that? Is that a possible tool? Is that something that's led to other discoveries? Like we have similar, for example, Star Trek and, tricorders and communicators becoming what we have today in various different sort of medical tools and mobile phones. Has the sonic screwdriver been based on anything science fact, or have there been any other things that have been predicted within Doctor Who that you know of?
Well, the sonic screwdriver was introduced in a 1968 story called Fury from the Deep. And the idea of that story was the script editor, Victor Pemberton, wrote the story, and he had to write out the companion Victoria. And Victoria spent most of her time in Doctor Who screaming and being utterly terrified of the monsters and shadows that she encountered in her travels. And Victor's brilliant idea was that they would face a
the Doctor Who novels, short stories, comics, audio dramas, etc., in addition to being a regular contributor to Horrible Histories magazine and the medical journal The Lancet Psychiatry. Simon is also the author of a recent nonfiction book he authored with Dr. Merrick Kukula called The Scientific Secrets of Doctor Who. He joins us on this episode to discuss this book and what the fantastical elements in Doctor Who can teach us about science in the real world. Welcome to the show, Simon Garrier.
Thank you very much for having me. Hello.
Yeah, so tell us a little about what inspired you and Dr. Kukula to write about real-world science through the medium of reincarnating Time Lord who travels through time and space in a police box battling evil robots and aliens.
Well, Marek, if he was able to join us on this programme, would tell you that Doctor Who was one of the things that inspired him to become an astrophysicist. And he wanted to be a Time Lord, or failing that, the companion Leela, I think. And that wasn't really a career option at school, so he did physics and ended up working at Jodrell Bank, the radio telescope. And then he worked on the space telescopes and has done all sorts of things and is now the public astronomer in Greenwich. So his sort of path to science and things through Doctor Who is quite clear. Mine was a bit more esoteric because I was an art student at school. I was hopeless at science at school and did my best to avoid it and dodge it as best I could. And then writing Doctor Who stories, a little to my horror, my editors would tell me I had to get the science right, or that I should put in explanations that sounded more scientific in the Dalek City, and they have to escape. And they do this by making a number of deductions that begin with noticing that the Daleks have a distinctive smell. They smell like the Dodgem cars at a fairground. And from this, they go through a sort of process of deductions about what might the Daleks be powered by, and therefore what their weaknesses might be. And as a result of this, they come up working together with a way of escaping the Dalek cell. And that's important not only because it's the first time that Doctor Who escapes from a prison cell, which becomes something he does quite a lot in the series, but Sidney Newman, who was the head of drama at the BBC at the time and the guy who co-created Doctor Who, wrote to Verity Lambert, the producer, after that episode went out, saying that scene was brilliant, that the thing of them using their intelligence, and we can follow, as an audience, we can follow the Doctor and his friends being intelligent to escape, was something that he thought was really good. And what you then see is the production team working in more scenes like that into the series. So this idea of the Doctor as almost like a scientific detective, but when he lands somewhere, there's a puzzle for him to solve. How does this world work? What are the rules? What are the strange things going on here? And actually, he does that even now. At the moment he steps out of the TARDIS, he's asking questions. What's going on? What are the rules of this world? And often that lands him in trouble with whoever's in charge of that world, which, there's as we say in the book, that there's a parallel with the scientific method right away.
Yeah, because, just to come with this one episode, David Tennant episode, and it's when the alleged ghosts are going about, and I do remember that Rose's mother actually kind of turns to him, and it's quite a good parallel.
So that a circle, that how much space, that's for a circle, but with a sphere that you can also use pi to work out the volume of a sphere. Except that's in normal space. In a black hole, the circumference doesn't match the volume inside. The volume is much greater because space-time is warped. So a black hole is bigger on the inside. And we know that from Doctor Who that the TARDIS is powered by a black hole. So when you step through the doors of a TARDIS, are you stepping over the event horizon into a realm within the black hole? And that's how it's bigger on the inside.
Hello and welcome to Trolling with Logic, the podcast where we bring the hammer down on ignorance, unreason, and superstition, and sometimes Daleks and Cybermen too, apparently. I'm Nathan Dickey, your host, and with me, as usual, is Cal.
Hi, it's good to be here.
And Jen.
Good evening or good midday to you.
And today we are joined by Simon Guerrier, a documentary filmmaker, science fiction author, and dramatist who pretty much lives and breathes in the worlds of Doctor Who. He has written many...
Perfectly plausible. So I found myself as a grown-up having to look into real science. And when I met Marek at an event that we were put together to teach kids about sort of Doctor Who and science and putting them together, I realised there was somebody who could do my homework for me. So I started sending him bits of plot going, how does this sound? Or what explanation can we give? And Marek was very patient for about a year in answering my questions, and then suggested that I did the GCSE course in astronomy that his observatory ran as a night class. So I did that, asked it, and we looked at working together and pitching a book. So we pitched a book to the BBC about Doctor Who and science.
Yeah, so we're talking about science and Doctor Who and where those two things intersect. And I'm thinking of in the Doctor Who story, for example, Day of the Daleks, the third Doctor states that he's a scientist, not a politician. So in what ways would you say the Doctor in any or all of his various incarnations exemplifies the scientific method in action?
Oh, wow. Well, that's a broad question. But, I mean, Doctor Who's been running since late 1963, and there's 840 odd episodes, so there's an awful lot of ground that we cover. I think it happens very early on. I mean, the Doctor is a scientist, he's a pioneer of his own people, but in I think it's episode 7 of the series, The Escape, which is the third episode of the first Dalek story, so very early on there's the Doctor and his companions are trapped in a cell